as well represented in things like community meetings and stuff like that as possible. So.
Yeah, so my background is mostly in youth organizing, particularly youth of color. I try not to use the term high-risk youth, but underserved youth who were primarily involved in the court system or in gangs. That's where my personal background is, growing up in an urban environment, so that's kind of where I ended up. Did 2 years of AmeriCorps. I saw the AmeriCorps t-shirt.
Oh yeah, I forgot I was wearing.
Worked with Mayor Menino's administration for a year, doing some work around education and community organizing. I've done community organizing for the past 10 years or so. Got my master's from Northeastern in urban and regional policy and planning. And started at the Allston Brighton CDC 3 months after receiving my master's. So just to give you some background. So gentrification, I tried my best to come up with a definition, but I mean, it's very different depending on like what neighborhood you're in. In Allston, Brighton, we're dealing with a few different issues on a few different fronts. So we're landlocked really by 3 major institutions. We have Boston University on one side, Boston College on the other, and then we're flanked by Harvard. Mostly their graduate campus. Their undergraduate campus is in Cambridge. And so we're dealing with a term, I guess you could call studification, where we're overrun by students in many of the neighborhoods in Allston Brighton, largely precipitated by investor landlords who will buy, let's say, a 2-family home for $1.6 million, which happened last year, turn every single piece of living space into a bedroom, and then rent them out at $1,000 per bedroom, and then cram them full of students. So we have one property across the street from our office where the landlord's making $15,000 a month on one unit because it has 15 bedrooms. And so we have that process, which is really making it hard for people to access the home ownership market, because unless you have access to $1 million or more, you can't buy a home in Allston Brighton. I haven't seen, in the 3 years that I've been there, I have not seen a standalone home sell for less than 1.2 million. So that's only getting worse. As you know, Harvard begins to expand in Allston Brighton, as you know, Boston College starts to increase enrollment, or Boston University starts to increase enrollment. And so we have the student issue. And then we also are becoming a hotbed for development from private developers. So we have about 3,000, last count I did, 3,000 units of private development in Allston Brighton. The starting rate for a studio in Allston Brighton is about $2,500 a month for new development. And they're mostly building studios, 1-bedrooms, and maybe a few 2-bedrooms sprinkled in order to alleviate some of the market pressures and try to provide more affordable housing. The Mayor Walsh in 2013 came out with this housing plan, which calls for 53,000 units of new housing to be built by the year 2030. Because in 2030, the city of Boston's population is expected to reach about 750,000 people. It's just over 653,000 now. And so in order to keep up with the rising housing costs, we need that much housing in order to stabilize the market. But what isn't being considered is that largely during the 20 years that Mayor Menino was mayor of Boston, there was no housing being built, but the population kept increasing. And so 53,000 units may not be enough to keep up with the demand. And so they came out with, the city of Boston came out with the Inclusionary Development Policy, IDP for short. And what it is any building that contains over 10 units has to contain 13% affordable. When Mayor Menino came out with it, it was 10%. And so if a developer was proposing a building for 10 units, one of them had to be affordable.
Affordable meaning?
70% of area median income. And so the area median income in the city of Boston for a family of 4 is about $103,000. The median income in the city of Boston is about $53,000. And so you can kind of see the mismatch there in terms of like, what is actually affordable and what's being marketed as affordable. And so the Boston area median income, or the area median income of the city of Boston also includes Newton, it includes Brookline, it includes Cambridge, it includes Braintree, Quincy, Somerville. And so there's a lot of high earning suburbs also just lumped in with the city, so it artificially inflates the area median income. So the rents at 70% AMI tend not to be affordable for many people who live in the city of Boston. And what it does is that it opens up housing for people who don't necessarily live in the city yet. The IDP units are based off the lottery, so anyone can apply to them. And so a lot of the time it's people who don't live in the city applying for an affordable unit and then are able to move to Boston. And so I kind of wrote down a few things that the Allston Brighton CDC, or largely what I'm doing in community engagement to kind of fight against gentrification and fight against, and make sure that people have a voice at the table. So the first one is kind of getting to know your neighbors and just reminding people that they do live in a community. At the Allston Brighton CDC, there's a community engagement department, which is pretty much me. And then we have resident services who, we have 2 resident services people. And so we work together every year to do a few kind of like block parties or cookouts for residents. And going back a little bit, the Allston Brighton CDC, we were established in 1980, and we are really an affordable housing developer. So we develop affordable housing in Allston Brighton. We have 9 developments in our portfolio that span across the entire neighborhood. We have just over 500 units of affordable housing in Allston Brighton, 505, and give or take 1,000 residents, because most of them are multi-family, and a lot of them are family households. So we kind of convene and facilitate and organize cookouts for the residents in our building, as well as inviting people from the broader community to come to really get to know people who live in affordable, because when you say, affordable housing, people think the caution tape and the drug dealing and a lot of like the crime that comes with, what people think of affordable housing. But we have families, we have teachers who live in our building, and really trying to put a realistic face to who lives in affordable housing. So that's kind of the first thing. The second is demanding affordable housing. So at the Allston Brighton CDC, we have an affordable housing action committee, which I lead. We are up to about 10 to 12 active participants, and we're really working to bolster and grow that committee, as well as support residents in our buildings to be more active participants in that committee. And so, protecting existing affordable housing and demanding that newly built housing is affordable is a strategy to fighting gentrification, and something that we utilize. So making sure that, and there's 2 different pushes that we're trying to do, and both at varying degrees of success. The first one is trying to get the city of Boston to not have the area median income determine affordability in Allston Brighton or in Boston, but really using the Boston median income, which would end up making units much more affordable. And then the second piece is offering units at deeper subsidy rather than 70%, but at 30, 40, 50, 60% of area median income. In order to make those numbers work, trying to set up partnerships where private developers build the market rate units and CDCs build the affordable units. Because if the developer, in the city of Boston, it costs about $300,000 to build an affordable unit. And so if they build 2, they cut the CDC a check for what that would cost, and then the CDC is able to build much more affordable housing than what the developer would do, because we have access to tax credits and other financing. And so that's something that we're looking at. Ensure every stakeholder in the community has a place at the table before the process advances too far. The City of Boston and the Boston Planning Development Agency, the BPDA for short, makes the development process really hard to understand. It could be on purpose, it might not be on purpose, no one really knows, but unless you know about zoning and setbacks and urban design and the lingo, the development lingo, it's really hard to engage in the process and know even what's being talked about. And then the city also isn't very good at engaging the community. The city's not community organizers. They don't really want a lot of people at the table. And so it's easier to kind of have the same 5 to 10 people at a community meeting. They argue about whatever they want to argue about, and then the city goes and kind of does what they want to do, and then the building gets built. We see that quite often. So what we're doing, and this is tied in with learn how the planning and development process works, is that in addition to the Affordable Housing Action Committee, we also have a Community Planning Action Committee. It was, as of last week, it was called the Article 80 and Institutional Master Planning Committee, which isn't really accessible language for anybody. And understanding that we want to do community education, we had to make the name of the committee more accessible. So it's really about community planning. So how does this Article 80 process work? And the Article 80 is really a zoning code in the city of Boston that so every buildings that are over 50,000 square feet get put into large project review, and everything under 50,000 square feet gets put into small project review. When a project gets put into large project review, which is most of the projects in Allston Brighton, because they're mostly large, dense projects, lots of units, the city puts together an impact advisory group, or IAG for short. And what the IAG is they are nominated, residents who are nominated to sit on this committee. They kind of work with the developer, they look at the project to really make sure that the project doesn't really impact the neighborhood in a negative way, and really try to get community benefits out of the developer that really meet the needs of the community. And so the problem with the IAGs is that they don't necessarily reach out or represent the entire community. Because they are nominated by the local elected officials, only the people that the local elected officials know end up getting nominated to IAGs. One thing that we have been doing is getting residents in our buildings nominated to IAGs. We have one resident right now on an IAG for a project on Rug Road in Allston, 40 Rug Road. And so her and I have had a lot of coffee going over the project notification form, which is a book that's like this big. That talks about shadow studies, traffic impacts, stormwater management, trash, everything that you need to know about the building. A lot of it, you kind of get glazed eyes looking over, but going through that with residents, making sure they know what are the important things to pull out of it, what are not the important things, and really working with them to be successful on the IAG, because ultimately we're trying to engage residents who live in not only our buildings, but the other affordable housing developments in Allston Brighton. So the BHA has 2. There's the Jewish Community Housing for the Elderly, which is affordable housing for seniors. And working with residents in these buildings to make sure that they are aware of how these projects will impact them, for the short and the long term. Use policy tools available to protect residents and preserve housing diversity. And so our approach is really around not only creating more affordable housing, but also preserving the affordable housing that's currently in place. In Allston Brighton, we have 2 properties that are designated under 13A, which is an affordable housing mechanism that was created 40 years ago. 13A is a mortgage, an affordable housing mortgage that was put together. We have one right over by BU, Babcock Towers, about 400 units. That 40-year mortgage is about to expire in the next 3 years. And so the owner of the building can either extend the affordability, sell it, or keep the building and kick everyone out and turn it market rate. The building, like I said, is 400 units. It's a really tall skyscraper. It's right next to BU. Like, it's on BU's campus on Com Ave. So that building is incredibly valuable. And if, BU wants to do dorms in that building, they could buy it, for millions of dollars, and then everyone would get, and it's a lot of Russian seniors who don't speak English who are in that building. So at the CDC, I'm trying to put together a strategy to really try to engage residents in that building around tenant rights and what are their options moving forward. Other legal tools, so there was the Jim Brooks Stabilization Act was just passed by the City Council in September. And what this is it's basically it's a just cause eviction protection that really states that landlords property owners shouldn't be able to buy property and evict everyone just because they want to turn at market rate, that they should have cause to evict somebody. So that might be non-payment of rent. It might be, criminal activity, violations of leases, those kinds of things. And before a property owner can evict anybody or increase rent, they need to send a letter to the city, which then starts a mediation process that says, how can we keep this resident here? And if that isn't going to work, then the city will, provide resources for like housing search and those kinds of things. So it's really a tenant protection bill. Inclusionary zoning I talked about, which is IDP. One thing that we're really focused on is increasing IDP from 13%, which isn't a lot, to 20%, similar to what Cambridge and Somerville has.
IDP is?
Inclusionary development policy, that's 13% of over 10. One thing that we're not seeing in Allston Brighton, but one thing that I'm seeing in South Boston, is that developers are proposing a lot of 9-unit buildings to get out of the affordability. So they're scattered sites, so they'll build 9 here and they'll build 9 here. It's the same development, but they're zoned in 2 different spots. And so they're able to build 18 units with 0 affordable units. So developers are starting to become a little more savvy in terms of that. And then the last piece is really training leaders and fostering political participation. And so we just rolled out our pilot Leadership Development Academy for residents in our buildings. It was a 5-session leadership development series of workshops that really tried to build and foster like the foundational leadership skills, active listening, effective communication, team building, asset mapping. We had 11 residents participate, all 11 finished. And then, there's opportunities for those residents to join one of the resident councils in their buildings, work with me in the Affordable Housing Action Committee, write letters to, the BPDA, the planning department of the city, the mayor, and really demand more affordable housing, tenant protections, those kinds of things. So we're really trying to attack this issue on all fronts, and really centered around a grassroots kind of social organizing or community organizing tactics, but also grass tops, policy, working with elected officials. And I think that two-stream policy, that two-streamed approach has been fairly successful so far. We're not going to be able to slow down development in the city, especially since the mayor came out with his housing plan calling for 53,000. So the city's going to try to get to that 53,000 as soon as possible. But we're really trying to figure out how can we support growth and how can we grow in a way that also maintains the character of the neighborhood, and how do we develop without displacing anybody.
Great. So who has questions? This is a really nitty-gritty grassroots look at creating affordable housing, preserving it. Yeah. Anna?
Can you talk about that building near BU that you were talking, which is more about the situation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is one, so it's kind of, the way that the footprint is, it's outside of Allston Brighton, but close enough that we're paying attention to it. So it's Babcock Towers. The owner, I don't think anyone's ever met him. I think he lives in New York. He's not really responsive to anybody, so it's really hard to gauge what his plans are for that particular building. A few months ago, there's an organizing group in the city, the Massachusetts Alliance of HUD Tenants. So they organize residents who live in federal affordable housing that HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Department, provides, mortgages for and affordability. And so I helped him out with a meeting. It was an introductory meeting about what the situation is going to be like. And his translation equipment didn't work. His interpretation equipment didn't work. He didn't really want to figure out why it wasn't working. So he kept doing there was a lot of Russian seniors in the room. Didn't want to really try to figure out why it didn't work. So a lot of them just left without knowing, what anyone was talking about, what the situation was. So we're trying to figure out a strategy internally. So how do we build relationships with residents in these buildings, and how can we help them? Because one potential avenue is there's a bill in the State House right now called the local option for tenant local options for a tenant's right to purchase, which means that if the residents, the tenants in Babcock Towers, for example, wanted to band together and pool money, they could potentially buy the building. That's not necessarily feasible just because of the land value and the value of the building. They could also designate a buyer, and then the buyer would have time to put together the financing available to purchase it. So if the residents of Babcock Towers, for example, got together and wanted the Alston Brighton CDC to purchase the building, we would have time to then put together a financing package in order to do that and then maintain the long-term affordability of that building. It is a local option, so that means that if it passes the State House, Boston could opt into that bill. But if you don't want to opt into it, you wouldn't have to. So we're kind of looking at all options for that building. There's not a lot of information going out because we really don't know what the owner wants to do with it, and we still have a few years before the 13A mortgage expires. So we're working with Representative Kevin Honen's office, Senator Brownsberger, and a few other Fenway CDC. The CDC in Fenway recently purchased Burbank Gardens, which was an expiring use property, a 13A property, and then they're going to turn it into long-term affordable housing. So we're also consulting with them to figure out, how did they do it? What was the process like? To try to see if we can do something similar.
Go ahead.
More on a general level, how many CDCs are there in Boston?
I think I counted once. I think it's about maybe 12, 13. So most neighborhoods in the city of Boston have a CDC. So South Boston, East Boston, Alston Brighton has one, Fenway has one. Dorchester has a few, just because Dorchester's so large. Most neighborhoods in Dorchester have one, so Codman Square, Fields Corner. The Fields Corner one is Viet Aid. It works primarily with the Vietnamese community in Fields Corner because there is a large Vietnamese community in Fields Corner. Jamaica Plain has one, so I think there's a good amount, probably about 20 or so. But the CDCs across the United States. There's an umbrella organization in Massachusetts called the Mass Association of CDCs that I think has, I don't even know, 80 members. So all the CDCs across the state are a part of this umbrella organization that provides technical assistance and support around community development. But one thing we're trying to do is really build coalitions across the city to try to advance this stuff, because no one's going to stop gentrification on their own. No one's going to solve the affordable housing crisis in the city by themselves. We had a meeting last night to figure out how we can coordinate across the city around Airbnb, because that's sneaking up on us. So Airbnb was designed for the small mom and pop kind of who wanted extra money to pay their mortgage, so they rent out an extra room from time to time. But we're seeing a lot of these new buildings get built. They go unrented, and then investors will come and purchase a bunch of rooms and then rent them out as short stay hotels. And they don't pay hotel taxes. They're not regulated the same way. And so Fenway CDC, Alston Brighton CDC, Asian CDC, and the Chinatown Progressive Association in Chinatown, we're really trying to brainstorm ways that we can kind of approach this issue in a kind of a collaborative coalition kind of.
I was wondering if you can talk, since you started the conversation talking about the dominance of students and the impact of universities, I'm wondering if you could talk at all about what's happening at the community level in collaboration with the universities, and if the city's involved at all, or what that dynamic is like.
Yeah, so I've been at the CDC for a little over 3 years, and my first thing was to organize the community forum on institutional expansion and student housing. When I came in, it was right after there were 2 fires in Alston. One of them killed a BU student, she was one of 18 living in a 4-bedroom. She had an attic apartment, no fire escape, no second way out, and so she ended up being a fatality in that fire. It was either the year before or the year after. Across the street, there was another fire. The young man lived in the attic apartment, had to jump out of the attic level window onto a frozen driveway, became paralyzed. And so it really opened up kind of or highlighted the need to really try to figure out the investor problem in order to provide safe and stable housing, not only for students, but for everyone in the community. That same year, there were 2 other fires resulting from overcrowding. One of them was down the street from our office where 77 Brazilian immigrants were displaced. We ended up having them in our office for about 2 weeks, kind of dropping in. We had D&D, the Department of Neighborhood Development, there doing housing search. We had the Brazilian consulate there kind of doing, making sure they could get their papers and get that whole thing situated. Right before that, there was another fire in Brighton that killed a gentleman in the basement, but there were, I think, 20 people living in a 3-bedroom. And so that kind of spearheaded our efforts around this. So in terms of the city, the city in their housing plan also has housing goals for student housing. I think that ultimately the neighborhood would want their students housed on campus, but BU, for example, BU is maybe a bad example. Northeastern, I don't know if we have any Northeastern students in Allston Brighton, so I'll pick on Northeastern. And I'm a graduate from there, so I can do that. Northeastern may not have any room on campus to build anything. They're kind of built out as it is, so it might make sense to build some dorms in the communities, like we have at 2000 Com Ave, which is a BC dorm, which is in the neighborhood, but kind of outside the neighborhood at the same time. And so I know the city is starting to put together some asks for universities, such as, you need to start housing more of your students on campus. Institutions are only allowed to grow when they make amendments to their institutional master plans. And so if Harvard, for example, wants to amend their institutional master plan, they'll need to include housing as a part of that. So they can't build any academic buildings until they build student housing. So that's kind of one thing that the Department of Neighborhood Development is looking at. But at the same time, I don't know if the city really wants, or if the mayor really wants to push too hard on universities because of the city's kind of public-private partnership stuff that they're trying to do, as well as, attracting, GE and Amazon and all these other large corporations to the city. They'll need institutional support in order to do that. One thing that we have going with Harvard University is our Albright Homeownership Program. And so the Allston Brighton CDC were able to negotiate with Harvard through their community benefits $3 million that we use to compete with investor landlords. So we have access to cash to purchase homes, and then we sell them to owner occupants with a deed restriction for 99 years to keep them owner occupied. And so if you're interested in living in Allston, it's really bound by Lower Allston, North Brighton, because that's kind of where Harvard's footprint is of the neighborhood. So if you're interested in buying a home but you have trouble accessing the housing market, you can buy a house through us, but you have to sign a restriction on your deed saying as long as you own that home, you have to live in it. The only way you can get away with renting is if it's a 2-family. So you can live in one and you can rent out the other, but it's really focused on stabilizing the neighborhood and trying to not have that neighborhood, because it's one of the last few neighborhoods in the city with a higher home ownership rate. Most of Allston's about 9% home ownership. Brighton's 21%. So we're really trying to stabilize the neighborhood and have more long-term invested residents. So that's kind of one strategy that we have. Did you have a particular thing you were looking for in that question? Or?
I guess I'm also curious about students. So we're all students here. Is there anything already happening in Allston Brighton, or are there opportunities you could foresee where, maybe that partnership could be improved and kind of, I don't know.
Between the neighborhood and students?
Yeah.
I think we've kind of started. So we have a student move-in campaign that we do every September, I get a few volunteers. Last year I had 10 volunteers from students from Boston University go out with me, which was much better than kind of like older residents, just because the dynamic is a little different. But we go out with volunteers and really talk to students as they're moving in. We talk to students and their parents if they're available while they're moving in, letting them know what the conditions of their housing units might be. So there's a neighborhood adjacent to our office. It's called The Gap. It's Gardner, Ashford, Pratt. Those are the cross streets. And it's mostly students. I think I can count the homeowners on one hand. And 2 years ago, there were 2 houses that were condemned while students are trying to move in. One house had, dead rats and rat traps, rat and mice feces all over the apartment, water damage, mold, no smoke detectors, no carbon monoxide detectors. And a lot of the time, from what I've noticed, a lot of the students who live in there are male. They're not there very often. They're like, I'll deal with this. It's not a big deal. But we try to get, inspectional services to, go around and do inspections to make sure the housing's safe. Through that strategy, we have been able to engage with students. So if there's a problem, especially with housing units in the Gap where we're so close to there, I've had a few students kind of make complaints about, we have a leak, our landlord's not being responsive, what should we do? And then I kind of provide them with a referral to inspectional services, who will then go and kind of do the inspection. Because students are not likely to go to the city directly because they think they're going to be kicked out and then they won't have anywhere to live while they're in school. So we're really trying to work with students around that. And then the second piece is I've been able to build relationships with a few students at Boston College. So we have students who sit on some of our committees. Excuse me. We kind of have a revolving BC chair that is always filled by some BC student. So if someone's studying abroad, they recruit someone to kind of fill it until they get back. And I think over the last 3 years, since kind of doing the student move-in campaign in a little different way, having students involved in our campaigns, it's really changed the dynamic and the conversation in the community, not necessarily blaming the students for the issues, but really looking at more of the structure in terms of like the landlords and the property managers who own these buildings, who are not maintaining them, and are filling them with students. And the students don't know that they're going to be living with 10 people because they found it on Craigslist. It says, you'll have a roommate, and then they move in and then 7 other people living there with them. So I think a lot of the times the blame is put on the student when it doesn't necessarily belong there, and really making sure that all voices in the discussion are really engaged and involved in it, because it's easy to kind of blame the party that's not sitting in front of you.
Yeah. So I think we need to kind of wrap up this segment of the class, and before I do though, I want to ask you one question that it will help us transition into the next thing we're going to do. We're going to be discussing a book by a social psychiatrist named Mindy Fullilove, who's studied the effects of displacement, especially on African American communities. And when I was talking to her about this whole project, she said that she felt like gentrification and the lack of affordable housing is, although it has to be addressed on the neighborhood level, is actually a national problem. It's a national crisis. And as I've said to this class a number of times, there's no county in the U.S., not a single one, where you can earn minimum wage and afford an apartment to live in.
Yep.
And so that has to do both with the income gap in the country and what minimum wage is, but also this and her thought was, well, if your students want to do a project, she said, they should design a campaign to assert that housing is a human right and that housing should not be a profit center. It was her opinion.
Yep.
And I know in other countries in the world there's national policies that do preserve more housing for low-income people or for regular people who are, just working people, I guess, put it that way. So, it sounds like you all in Allston Brighton are doing a huge amount of work. There's no shortage of work, maybe having some modest successes in relation to the dynamics of this particular neighborhood, but just briefly, because we do have to move on, but how do you think of your work relating to this national problem, and global problem for that matter.
Yeah, so I try not to go too far down that rabbit hole, because once you kind of think, it's going to be hard enough to change the issue at kind of like the local scale, without really trying to figure out how you're going to change it at the national
Right.
or world kind of global scale. But I mean, it's also really thinking about, you know, rolling a snowball and
Yeah.
small wins and really working locally. And what we saw from the recent presidential election is that local matters, and local politics matter. And really, you know, before we can change affordable housing in the city of Boston, we need to change affordable housing in Allston Brighton, which will then kind of ripple out and ripple out. We have this slogan where housing is the foundation of prosperity. And so really looking at it in terms of a human right, or, you know, public health. Housing is where it should start. If you have safe housing and affordable housing, you can accomplish many other things. So in terms of like the national scale, it is a national problem, but really trying to spearhead the local fight, which then you can kind of bring in partners and things to kind of maybe ripple out a little bit. But
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much for
You're welcome.
coming up with this. Okay, my friends, let's, in our last time together, let's see if we can summarize for ourselves this book on urban alchemy. And so let's see, there's like 3 people who are in this introductory part who can, are you guys ready to share stuff? Yes? And who do we have from part 1? Okay, I'll do part 1.
Oh no, we've got part one.
Yeah. Oh, no, you guys are part 1. So who's part 2? Who's that?
Kiana.
Kiana, okay, great. So are you prepared to share a few ideas from part 2, Kiana?
Sure. Give me 1 second. Let me just find my reading.
Yeah,
From the elements reading, correct?
correct.
Yes.
I'm not asking you to do it right now, I just wanted to get a sense from you if you can do it.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
I have my paper up.
Okay. And then part 3 is who? Okay. And are you two saying that you need some time to prepare?
I would benefit from like a 5-minute discussion.
Okay, ahead of time? Okay. And then part 4, and could you do this? Okay. I'm trying to figure out if we should take this 5-minute break. Why don't you two meet for 5 minutes, and the rest of us, why don't we look at this framing of the problem and see if after what's been going on today, we want to adjust or add anything to that. So can you guys kind of like up to a corner, and we'll just take a look at this, and then we'll get into the book. Okay? Yeah. So, Hauke, do you want to summarize for us what's here?
Sure, yes. This kind of based on what you guys, what we were discussing last week and what we wrote in the board. And we're kind of talking about framing the problems that we've identified. So looking at what can we focus on and how could we split up the groups next week in kind of focus areas, perhaps. So, and then we had some related questions that kind of built on that to form these. So one was kind of what we might be exploring with the book, as well as this idea of strengthening local communities. And the 2 really key questions was, how can the local culture be sustained, and how to bring voices of those impacted by gentrification to the conversation. And I guess this question also is really important, how to remain vigilant of diversity within the communities and migrant populations. And that was with the woman from the Waltham CDC who also mentioned the undocumented migrants, so thinking of both legal and illegal migrants. And then part of that was also looking at this idea of siloization, where people kind of live in their enclaves like we saw today with the building where one side is the luxury apartments and the other side is the affordable housing, so that you don't have the two sides mixing. And then this was almost more of a solution, but it might be an idea of shaping it around education. Looking at what kind of education programs could be structured, both for developers, government, but even connected to local communities, and how kind of, based on what we also heard from the CDC today, how you teach that and what's important to teach. Then finding alternative ways that developers could make profit. So exploring the idea of profitability, and if it's hard to convince developers of making less money, how do you find other solutions that they could still make a reasonable amount of money from their developments. And then lastly, something that Brown really talked about and that you guys also thought was really important is this idea of, as soon as there is safety in the community, then a lot of the youth that are also starting to make more money in these communities, or that become entrepreneurs instead of drug dealers, are actually, as soon as they have enough money, moving their families out of these communities into safer communities. And how can you actually create ownership of a community to get people to stay? And that might be another kind of overarching question.
Well, I think he was also saying that there are people who are in these gangs and doing drugs and who have tremendous business skills.
Yeah.
But how could those be translated from this kind of activity that's very destructive to lives and communities into constructive entrepreneurial activity?
Yeah.
I just want to say something about number 2, educating developers and government about what could be lost. So you're right, that's a potential solution, but underneath that idea is a framing of the problem. And I have a question about the framing of the problem, because I think what's underneath this point is that developers and government people are actually ignorant. And if we could just educate them about what's being lost, they would change. I think that's possible in some cases, perhaps, but I'm not sure it's ignorance that's actually in their way.
Yeah.
I think it might be greed or just desire for profit.
Yeah.
And in that case, education alone may not be a sufficient strategy. Anna?
I think you have a really good point that they probably know, at least to like a large extent, what they're destroying or relocating or moving, but they don't really care. So then I think, like, especially because we're in this class, there's the idea that art can sort of provide like a step towards empathy and understanding without kind of like getting in someone's face and sort of like giving them an opportunity to care on their own. Because I feel like there's like that cognitive dissonance. Like if you really care about something and value something, it's a lot harder to destroy it. So I don't know if that's like where our responsibility lies or like our initiative lies, but I think you're right.
So what I'm hearing you say is like, well, maybe art could offer an invitation to these folks to see things in a more caring way, or to change how they feel about what the people in the community and what's being lost. So anyway, maybe when we sit down and reframe this, we can take a look at that. So now, having heard Wen-Ti's presentation and Jason's presentation, do you have any other ideas about how this issue could be framed? Anything you want to add?
Maybe also about number 2, like putting it in a different way. I would leave developers on a side because I think they are like a different kind of problem. But maybe trying to show government that what they are earning because of the development
they are going to spend it in health and in security policies if they don't take care as the whole picture at the same time. So maybe educate is not like the world, and maybe it doesn't work like this with politics science because it's always shorter. So you have your election, you have your 4 years, and the other guy is going to pay for health and security. But maybe it could be effective, like to show all the effects.
Like
of
raise awareness,
Sorry?
like raise awareness about the effects, right?
I mean, like showing numbers because, like,
It's like showing the costs.
yes, the cost.
The cost of gentrification.
Yes, in terms of money and in terms of politics, maybe, right? Like a part of the thing. I really don't believe that this is the solution, but I think that showing the cost of the whole thing may be a part.
I mean, when we think about changing government policies, there's kind of informing, educating, but there's also pressuring, right?
Mhm.
There's also, kind of holding people to account
Yes.
in certain ways. So there might be strategies that relate to developers and government that may have an educational component, but education may not be the whole of it. But I'm interested in this impulse to not like make the developers bad necessarily, like Reverend Brown was saying, like maybe there is some possibility that some anyway could change. But I'm assuming that the strategy isn't just going to be only educational. Okay, let's unless anyone wants to jump in, thank you. Can we go ahead? Yeah, go ahead.
I just have one thing from just Jason's talk about accessibility of information, because I think that's something that really affects not only the local communities of people who are like from the Boston area, but also the students. I don't think like fellow students, I don't think we have accessibility to information to know what's going on with gentrification and the fact that we might also be contributing to it. I think it can kind of go under this strengthening local communities as like an offshoot of that, but just, I don't know, and that can happen in a variety of ways, but that was just one thing that I thought was interesting from his point.
And the jargon as well, like making the language something that's more understandable for folks. But yeah, I think that would go under.
But I
that
think
piece.
Identifying students as a group to be informed, educated, mobilized, whatever, is an interesting idea that we should leave up here. Because local communities, yeah, students are, but there's also the people who've lived, for a long time, and they're not the transients who are coming in and out. And that strategies for those folks might be different than for the students.
That's true.
Yes.
Regarding the strengthening local communities, but I think it's like a good point. And considering this book, I think that we also should mention that strengthening local communities, but also getting other communities in the agenda because of this thing that maybe the people that won't have problems with their houses won't notice the problem at all unless they see that they are having problems because of security, because of violence, because of whatever. So you don't involve them on this fight, but you get them like pushing with you, with the governments. Maybe like a strategy, if you only focus on local communities, I mean, maybe it's not like enough. I mean, I'm thinking about what she says about thinking the city as a whole and not only.
Yeah. So why don't we go to her,
Okay.
and then we hopefully will have a few minutes at the end to see, as a result of this, what we might add here. Okay. So let me just say something in general about this book. I think it's a complicated book. because it's sharing the perspective of this French architect and urban planner and what went on in a number of French cities, and also how the woman, the author of the book, was learning from him and taking that knowledge and applying it to this US context, especially in Pittsburgh, but also there were stories from New Jersey and other places in this country. So, what I'd like to ask you to try to do is to distill 2 or 3 points from the parts that you read that you think could be really informative to us. And maybe it's like through one example, because it's chock full of many examples, right? I think it's instructive also about creative process, like how long of a process of learning there was, and how, people were working in 10-person research teams over numbers of years. So I think that's kind of instructive too. So with that, just framing, can you share your what you think you should bring forward from the introductory section?
Yep. So, sure. Yeah. So this is somewhat touching on what Victoria was just saying, but the real takeaway that we found in the introductory section was how her perspective as a social psychologist really kind of frames this book and kind of led her to look at things from a systems perspective. So she talked about systems therapy, where the problems are often better understood as symptoms of a disorder in the mechanism of a larger whole. And so that was something that we'll touch on, I guess, as we go into chapter 1 and chapter 2. But that was kind of the big takeaway.
Okay. Well, we've been discussing it, and we think that it's interesting because, for instance, with Reverend Brown, we saw how working with people can change the urban environment. And what she's proposing is that environment conditions who you are. And there's this paradox where that's the first thing he mentions, that is that in the path to desegregating societies, what we finally did was partitioning, like in race and religion, and that provokes what we see as the final result, which is violence and disease. But maybe her main point is showing that this violence that we can locate in one specific neighborhood is a symptom of what she reads like a main body, which is the city. Well, I'm trying to choose what to say because it's like a lot. Well, then she speaks about, and that's what I was like thinking right then, about this concept of map flags. I don't know if this appears in the other chapters. Map flags, like the plagues from the Bible, different diseases.
Mad plagues.
Oh, mad plagues.
Plagues, sorry.
Plagues.
And this is interesting because she relates how by researching the impact of building policy is related to AIDS in the 80s. And that's where she starts. You see, seeing how in Black communities the AIDS is growing because of the way they live, because of their houses and how they share space. And then she discovers that this thing, this building thing and how they use space has many bad consequences, and this is what she calls the mad plagues, because AIDS is related with drugs and with violence and with tuberculosis, and there again she says that you need to see it in two ways. For in one hand, you need to see that once you have one disease, you are going to have many others. And the other and very important part is that you won't be able to keep it in within the neighborhood, that it will spread out. And that enforce her view of the city as a whole. And I think it is an important point for us in this lab, because like to give us a tool like to make a zoom in and a zoom out on the problems that we have.
So a framing that comes from that is the idea that, like, okay, you could look at Chinatown, as we did, but you could also look at Boston
Yeah.
and see the way that Chinatown, through the highways and segregation and other issues, was cut off. And what Fulilov's idea is that for a city to be healthy enough to solve its problems, including gentrification, but other problems, the different people, the different voices of the city have to be able to interact and share knowledge and perspective. And a city that's segregated in the way that most of our cities are stops doing its work as a city. So maybe the approach that we would want to take is like how to make the city have these points of how to make the city and its neighborhoods be welcoming, I think is the word that she would use, to create the welcoming
Yes.
city.
And there's an idea there that maybe we can use, that she says that these problems that she identified, that this is the lack of the center of the city, the weak areas around it, etc., these are the specific problems, are also related with the lack of common platform for collective thinking.
Yeah.
So this common platform could be an idea that we could, like, I mean, actually everybody is saying it, how this guy told us about these groups that they have, Brian Brown did too.
We should move on.
Yeah, sorry. Well, and then she groups the 9 elements in 3 groups.
That's okay, you don't need to go there.
Okay.
Do you have anything you want to add?
So we did chapter 2, so did you want us
Okay.
to talk about
Yeah.
chapter 2?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll try to run through. We have more notes than we have time for, but keeping on the health perspective, she talks about nostalgia as being a life-threatening illness, which I thought was a really interesting way at looking at this, and that we can't overestimate the extent to which we love and need our homes and neighborhoods. So it's not just like I miss being home. It's actually something that kind of takes hold of you and is embedded in your identity and is super powerful. And yeah, I'll move on from there. But did you want to add anything to that?
I don't think we have time for it.
Yeah, and so she talks about, really quickly, she talks about redlining as well, and kind of the health impacts of redlining, which is a section that if you haven't read it, I would totally go back and read it. I think it's really important. But it's talking about basically assigning neighborhoods like a risk assessment, I guess, based on largely identities that are non-white. So whether it's or even not non-white, there was a Jewish label that was used. There was like African American label that was used, and these labels are used in order to deem an area as threatening. And so what that did on kind of the national scale was it meant that, well, for one, this was a national policy. This was a federal agency making these determinations, but it was turning like very necessary resources away from these specific communities based on these assessments. And then, I don't know if you want to go, we could maybe do the assets and
Or,
assets and grief.
I think we can turn grief into. Well, I can talk about the grief thing.
Okay.
And just talk about assets, good.
So she talks about being asset focused, which is something that often in these conversations is left out. So making sure that Jason referenced asset mapping, but essentially it's kind of like tracking and pinpointing the different resources that you have available as a community and that you can leverage, and kind of what different people are bringing to the table to create that whole and be able to have a more comprehensive approach. And kind of without putting attention to this, what can happen is you can really render people powerless and end up really disempowering a population that you're trying to help lift up. So I think that was a really important point to make. And she had some questions that she ran through to get people to start thinking about their community and the positive pieces of their community and really shift the conversation around the things that are going wrong in making it a more empowering process. And on the other side of the coin, she talks about grief as well and the importance that grief plays. So if you want to touch on that.
Yeah, so this was just kind of all over chapter 2, just labeled in different ways, but overall, just this idea of like recognizing the grief that takes place when people are displaced from their neighborhoods, and also almost harnessing that grief and like the anger that is that people feel in these situations, because we don't want to just brush it off. We want people to be angry about this because they're losing their homes, they're losing this this whole idea of like this, safety and family. And so one thing that she references is her time in residence with the Dr. Goldstein, who just says that victims are better off when they're angry, because then it just basically proves how serious of a situation it is. So I guess it's more so of a point of like just recognizing that people are going to be really angry in these situations and that it's not a bad thing. And then I guess just the final thing that we kind of pulled from chapter 2 is like a success criteria that she laid out. And so it's people live in a good enough place, people feel settled in home, neighborhood, and region, people contribute to caretaking of the personal and shared portions of the environment, and people know their neighbors and interact with them to solve problems. And I think this kind of comes back to the point of like building that welcoming neighborhood. Yeah.
And I would just really quick add to that at the end, when she was talking about some examples of success, she was talking about how the community was able to move past anger and really channel that in a way that was empowering. And they were also able to find some really important allies, I think, in this conversation that showed the respect to the community and to them as local experts and a group of people that have experienced grief and need to be recognized as such and respected. And I think really did that in a very powerful way that gave the community a sense of agency back that has really kind of led to more and more engagement. And they're saying that, the community is so engaged that they're able to demand community benefit packages and make different demands from developers that, are moving in the direction where they might not be that, dense, vibrant community that they were in the 30s, but they're rebuilding, and it's a slow process, but it kind of needs to be right now to do it responsibly.
Okay, great. There's a lot for us to think about in all that. But let's move on for the sake of time. So keeping the whole city in mind, Kiana, that was part of the chapters that you read. Keeping the whole city in mind, find what you are for, and making a mark. You want to tell us a bit about those? What did you find in those chapters that would be useful for us?
Give me 1 second. I wrote it in my paper. Can you repeat the beginning part that you said, because it got choppy?
Yeah, I want you to think about 1 or 2 ideas from the sections that you read that you think would be useful for us in thinking about how to frame the problem and creative approaches. So there were 3 chapters in that section, right? Keeping the whole city in mind, finding what you are for, and making a mark. So if you had to take like 1 or 2 ideas from all of that, what would you say we should really notice?
I've said, okay, so I focused on the part where she brought up thinking like a city. It's more so in the beginning.
Okay.
And I think I put that part because that part was more important to me, because I never really heard anybody like put it into context of thinking as the actual city and not the people within the city. Give me 1 second.
Kiana, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. And then so with that being said, when she says like thinking about the city, I took it as she's saying we need to think of, make decisions for the greater good and not just for the individuals that are specifically affected, but like we need to focus on how can we make this city look great to bring people here and make it feel like a home for people.
Mhm.
It's like a little choppy, but that's kind of what I was getting from it, like making people want to come and stay and like make it more community based.
Mhm. I think, she was saying that when cities have been destroyed in various ways, or the energy has gone out of a part of a city, it's that it's important to bring back life and energy in so that people are attracted to being there, right?
Yeah.
And she uses words like finding a way to make a city or a neighborhood enchanting and enriching and enlivening. One thing that she talks about, which I think could be really important to us, is the nexus of memory, reason, and imagination. So looking at the past, thinking about the present context, and imagining what could be. And where those three kind of conceptual ideas overlap is where she says you can find a path to revitalizing the city, creating places of meaning that will attract people. Kian, I just wanted to mention that I thought in what you wrote as your reflection that it was interesting that you, and drawing on your own experience growing up in Harlem, actually, you said that you hadn't really seen people in a city fight to hold on to the things that were really valuable to them. And that's, I think, a really interesting and important perspective. Do you just want to say a bit about that?
I'm sorry. Just repeat the last, you said you want me to explain what? About Harlem?
Just that you had not seen people really fight for what they wanted to hold on to. They hadn't fought to hold on to the things that mattered to them.
Why people don't fight for it?
It's okay. We'll just leave it there because we just don't have time. I was quoting from what you wrote to me.
If you type it to me, I'll type the response, or I can say the response.
No, we'll do it later. I'm sorry. I would do it if we're just running out of time. Okay, so that's some of the part of the beginning of the book. So now people who are working on part 3. So, okay, Emily and Don, right? What do you think are the most important ideas from there?
Well, I had a list of 8, but I think I could boil it down to 2.
A little louder so people can hear you.
I had a list of 8, but I think I could boil it down to 2.
Okay.
And that is whatever you do in terms of community planning and development, it must be done with clarity and fidelity to both people and place.
Okay. That's a big idea. What do you think that really means?
Well, some of the things that I wrote down were that perspective brings a sense of harmony and unity to both people and planning, and that is drawn from their experience in the French Garden, and then both trying to create the giraffe, and they find those staircases. Mm-hmm. Another one. Be as minimally invasive and intrusive as possible, and it is vital to respect the history of a place, and that was mainly drawn from when Chantal, when he pierces the wall and makes that thoroughfare.
Yeah. It's interesting, it's in a way that connects to what Wenti did in putting these people, historical figures in the city. It's like shining a light on and finding some perspective on the history that was there. Yeah? Okay? Emily?
Yeah. So like the chapters within part 3 were on I'm puzzling and I'm slumming. so I took out that unpuzzling and putting things into perspective is a part of unpuzzling. And when we do both of those things, it allows us to see things more clearly. And like opening up different perspectives is like a way to like find out how to solve the problem. And we saw this in like the example where she was talking about the park in New York on like the border of West Harlem and Washington Heights. And they were trying to get like a group of kids to like cross a street. But like there was a West Side Highway. And then a guy who I don't remember his name unpuzzled it and gave her idea, and suddenly it was so much more clear.
To find the path that they could take to go from south to north in the park that
Yeah.
wouldn't put the kids at risk, right?
Yeah.
The path was emerged as they studied the space.
Mm-hmm. And then also like unpuzzling and unslumming are like very intertwined, and like which they don't necessarily have to go in a certain order. Like it depends on the situation which one comes first, and they like work in a cycle leading to each other. And it's like also a natural process of connections between people that can make cities safer and more functional faster. And then the last thing I took out of it, which was like kind of a point that was made through the book as a whole, is that sorting the city into lots of tiny neighborhoods defeats like the main point. Like you wanna like look at it as a whole and work together as an entire city to like identify and solve problems.
So you can have small neighborhoods that feel very village-like and comfortable, but there needs to be flow, right, between these different neighborhoods. And yeah, great, okay. She emphasized something that we've been thinking about all semester, really, from Jane Sapp onward, about finding the resources for regeneration from within cities and in impoverished neighborhoods themselves. Not seeing that we have to impose something from the outside, but seeing what resources are there. Okay, so, fourth section.
Really? Okay.
So we got the last section, and one of the points that really stood out to me was this whole concept of a feedback loop. That was really important to me because, like, she talked a lot about how it's not just like essential or like, no, she stresses the importance of really breaking down the community and analyzing it for its whole. What makes a community like, or basically what makes it a community, and how can we continue to give positive feedback loops to the community members. So she gave the example of like, if you have a community where you have a lot of violence, a lot of drugs, prostitution, and so on, then that's a negative feedback loop. It's causing people to go away. But if you truly analyze the community for what it is and its culture and its values and what it's composed of, then you can turn that negative feedback loop into positive feedback loop. So to me, just like in order for me to truly analyze or like understand, I kind of saw it as a transformation, and I related it to this class because it's essential to understand the community and make those connections, and then in the end, like give people reasons to come back and stay permanently for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, and like we came up with this with a conversation, but the other thing that we sort of pulled out from the 2 chapters on showing solidarity with all life and celebrating accomplishments is that there needs to be sort of a mixing of people. So having parties be long and multiple days, or having sort of like ownership over spaces by different people in different communities helps bring different groups of people together that wouldn't normally meet by chance. And that's sort of a way to draw those connections between communities so that it feels more like a city rather than like small divided groups. And so the author talks about 6 parts of the party and how like there's re-engagement and then you talk about it and you go home, then you come back and there's more of the party the next day. And how that can like contribute to a positive feedback loop because we're celebrating accomplishments and showing solidarity with all the people, as opposed to just a group.
It's like an ongoing conversation that's within the community, and that's just really important to highlight, and especially in this level.
Yeah, I was rereading this book and I was thinking, and I'm reading this whole chapter like on a party, right? She goes to great lengths to describe this elaborate party that took place in France, and then you realize what she's trying to teach us is, yeah, there has to be this ongoing conversation, but then there have to be moments where the community shows itself to itself or celebrates, like an intensification. And it reminded me also of her saying, you know, that cities can give us places where we move away from the everyday and actually are regenerated to face the problems, places of great beauty and power in that way. So
It would be beautiful to have a city like that.
Well, maybe it means that we have to have a party somehow in our class. I don't know. But so I know that this was like a lot to take in, but Hauke, you've been typing away, so I think you might be gathering some ideas that can feed our questions of framing. And I know we need to get going shortly, but I just want to say this. So there's no real assignment for next week. I want you to enjoy the holiday and think about the design lab. But if you do have ideas, so we're going to be dividing into a few groups, a few small groups, 2, 3, 4, something like that. If you have an idea of a question that you'd like to work on with small groups coming from our list or a reframing of this, please email Hauke and me. And then Emily and Hauke and I are going to kind of try to pull together these, come to class next Tuesday with a proposal of how we're going to work. If you'd like to be part of that conversation, we're going to meet on Monday afternoon. If you're free, you could join us, like at 3:30, I think we're planning to meet. And then we'll see what we can, and I'm hopeful that even though we rushed through this conversation of Fullalov's book, that as you're working on the problem, some of her ideas will come back to you, and that we'll combine different ones of you that have worked on different parts will have the benefit of her considerable insight, I think, into, so she's not only dealing with gentrification, right? She's dealing with how do you create joy in cities, and I love that framing, but speaking of framing of issues. Last thoughts or questions, complaints? Okay. So, see you back here, right, next week. Have a safe holiday. Have fun. Thanks for coming in. Okay. Yeah.
How are you doing?